In this video, I'm going to talk about the origins of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and the events that took place during the Anglo-Irish War and the Irish Civil War that led to the creation of these two parties. In most countries, the two main parties are centre-left and centre-right. When it comes to the elections, the voting public is given the option of a government which is led by the centre-left or a government which is led by the centre-right. In the United States, those two parties are the Democrats and the Republicans. In the United Kingdom, those two parties are Labour and the Conservatives. In Ireland, the two parties which have historically led governments are Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. So when it comes to the election, the voting public usually has the option of a government led by Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. Now what's different here is that they aren't centre-left and centre-right. Both of these parties are centre-right, so Ireland is something of an anomaly in this sense. This is because Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil used to be one party, called Sinn Féin, sometimes referred to as Old Sinn Féin to distinguish it from the modern party led by Mary Lou MacDonald, which is not the same party as this Old Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin was effectively the political wing of the old IRA that fought for independence against the British security forces in the Anglo-Irish War that started in 1919. This war is also known as the Irish War of Independence. There was considerable overlap between Sinn Féin and the IRA. Many people were members of both. Despite the fact that Sinn Féin was supporting an armed rebellion which was trying to secure independence, it's remarkable how conservative and moderate they were in other respects when it comes to their economic policies and their social policies. Now we know this because in the decades that followed this war, the Irish government was made up almost entirely of people who had been members of Sinn Féin and the IRA, and we can see the policies that they introduced. They weren't left-wing, and when it came to social issues, they were conservative. A lot of them were devout Catholics. When the British left and Irish rule began in Ireland, very little changed. This new government, the only really big changes that it made were the promotion of the Irish language and the banning of divorce. In fact, it has been said that the government that took over after this Irish Revolution was perhaps the most moderate government that's ever taken power after a revolution anywhere in the world. So Sinn Féin at this stage was essentially a moderate centre-right conservative party. By 1921, this war was at a stalemate and the British government offered terms. This is known as the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Now these terms provided for significant independence for Ireland, but not quite a 100% independent Irish Republic. This caused a lot of debate and division within Sinn Féin. The party at this point split into two factions, an anti-treaty faction and a pro-treaty faction. The anti-treaty faction argued that they couldn't accept these terms because they weren't being granted an Irish Republic. The other pro-treaty faction argued that the independence being offered was enough, that it provided the freedom to win ultimate freedom in the future. Ultimately, history would prove that the pro-treaty side was correct on this issue. A vote was held in the Irish Dáil on the treaty, and the pro-treaty side won. This was the first victory of the pro-treaty side over the anti-treaty side. In the weeks that followed, Eamon de Valera undertook a speaking tour of the Southwest. He made a number of controversial and notorious speeches, in particular in Thurles and Tipperary, where he said that if Ireland accepted the treaty, it would be necessary for the anti-treaty IRA to, quote, wade through the blood of Irish soldiers and Irish politicians, end quote. A general election was held in June 1922. Both factions within Sinn Féin campaigned, both calling themselves Sinn Féin. One was arguing for the treaty, one was campaigning against the treaty. The pro-treaty side won the election. Labour, by the way, was also in favour of the treaty. Most politicians were in favour of the treaty. Based on the results of this general election, it would appear that most of the population was in favour of the treaty. However, most of the IRA, the soldiers, the fighters who had fought against the British in the Anglo-Irish War, most of them were opposed to the treaty. At this point, the pro-treaty faction of Sinn Féin had become the official government of Ireland, the national government. This was the government that was recognised by Britain. The pro-treaty IRA had become the National Army, also known as the Free State Army. The anti-treaty IRA rejected absorption into this new army. They occupied large areas of Ireland, particularly the southwest, which was their stronghold. They also occupied the Four Courts in Dublin, which is the location of the Irish Supreme Court. Although no fighting was taking place at this stage, there was a tense atmosphere. The menace of civil war hung heavily in the air. Neither side wanted to initiate the fighting. Both sides wanted to avoid bloodshed. The British government, meanwhile, which still had soldiers in Dublin, it hadn't withdrawn all of its forces from Ireland yet, was putting pressure on the national government, the pro-treaty side, to take action against the anti-treaty IRA, in particular to end their occupation of the Four Courts in Dublin. On the 28th of June, the National Army attacked the anti-treaty IRA units in the Four Courts in Dublin. This is considered to be the start of the Civil War. They subsequently drove anti-treaty IRA units out of Dublin. Most of the fighting for the next year or so took place in Munster in the southwest. These are soldiers from the pro-treaty army, also called the National Army or the Free State Army. This was a conventional army. They wore a standard uniform and they were well equipped with weapons supplied by Britain. There was three types of soldiers in this army, three types of men really. First, you had former IRA volunteers who had fought in the Anglo-Irish War against the British. Then you had Irish men who had fought in Irish regiments in the British Army in World War I, so these guys also had combat experience. Then you also had people signing up who had no military experience. They hadn't fought in the Anglo-Irish War or the First World War. In terms of numbers, they were initially smaller than the anti-treaty forces, but as the war went on, their numbers became bigger, and by the end of the war, they massively outnumbered the anti-treaty forces. These are fighters from the anti-treaty side. They're also referred to as irregulars. This was a term that they didn't like. They referred to themselves as Republicans or the IRA. They were mostly veterans of the Anglo-Irish War. These were guys who had mostly fought against the British. They were a lightly armed guerrilla force. They always struggled with a lack of ammunition and weaponry, in particularly heavy weaponry artillery. They had no standard uniform and often wore trench coats or greatcoats. The Irish Free State soon launched an amphibious offensive into Munster. They quickly retook the cities and large towns: Waterford, Cork, Limerick, Tralee. The rest of the war was largely fought in rural areas in Munster. Free State forces would launch search and destroy missions trying to root out the IRA in these areas. IRA tactics would involve ambushes and the extensive use of IEDs, which were referred to as mines at the time. The use of these IEDs in particular enraged the Free State forces, who considered them to be cowardly. This contributed to several atrocities carried out by the Free State forces towards IRA prisoners which they had taken. In August, the IRA killed Michael Collins in an ambush. Michael Collins was the leader of the Free State Army. He was perhaps the greatest hero of the Anglo-Irish War against the British. He was an exceptionally intelligent and capable man. He likely would have become Prime Minister of Ireland many times in the 1920s and 30s. His death further contributed to the animosity felt by the Free State forces towards the IRA rebels. The IRA also conducted assassinations and they attacked infrastructure. They also burnt down the homes of many large landowners who were perceived to be pro-Free State. Many of these landowners, the owners of these homes, were Protestants, and it remains a matter of debate to this day to what extent these attacks may have been sectarian in nature. The Irish Civil War became a bitter affair. This was brother against brother, friend against friend. These were men who had fought together against the British and now were fighting each other. The execution of IRA prisoners Sometimes these were summary executions, sometimes these were atrocities and massacres. This in particular created bitterness and division in Ireland. This legacy of bitterness and division lasted for many, many decades. In May 1923, the IRA ordered its soldiers to dump its weapons and to cease operations against the Free State. There was no surrender, however the Civil War was effectively now over and the pro-treaty side had won. Most of the anti-treaty side now abandoned violence, and in 1926 they founded a new party called Fianna Fáil. The pro-treaty side would eventually become Fine Gael. Despite the fact that these two sides, these two parties agreed on an awful lot, they were both essentially centre-right conservative parties, they never reunited, and this was because of the division and the scars and the animosity that was left over from the Irish Civil War. Even in decades to come, after Ireland had become a completely independent republic and the initial reason for division between these two parties was no longer relevant, it was moot, they still didn't reunite. In fact, not only did they not reunite, it would be almost a century before they would even join each other in a coalition. This happened in 2020 and it was a historic event. It was the first time that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael had ever worked together in a coalition, despite the fact that they agreed on many, many issues. In my next video, I'm going to talk about what Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are like today in 2024, what policies they have and what the differences are between them now. If you have any questions or any suggestions for future videos, please post them in the comment section and I will answer them. In the meantime, thanks for watching and until next time.